Zach, Zach, just start the thingy. Just share, like how we do it.
Sorry, I'm having some audio issues. Did you say something to me?
Yeah, I was saying just share the debate. We can start now.
Okay, yeah.
Just invite the PM.
Oh, I'd like the government PM to, I guess, talk.
Awesome. All right, cool. If y'all wouldn't mind putting your POIs in the chat, please do not verbalize them. I'm going to get started in 3, 2, 1. All right, so the first thing we're going to do as the government, before we talk about like what we think a pass-fail system realistically looks like, is to talk about like what GPA is and particularly like how it affects our lives, right? Because we see that our GPA is highly determinant of the things we can do after higher education. It is going to be the thing that every employer looks at. It's going to be the thing that every law school, med program, just, PhD program determines about you, whether or not you are worthy to be in their system. And we're going to talk about why this is extremely problematic in a second. But for the first thing I want to do is point out is that this system is incredibly arbitrary. We see that most classes are not like a math class, right? Where there's one right answer and many wrong answers. Many classes fall into this kind of weird gray space, like English classes, sociology classes, pretty much any class that requires you to do at least any form of creative writing is going to be highly arbitrary to the professor of what they consider to be good or bad work. And we see that as a result of this, that, students that, the professor likes a lot will be able to get much higher grades than, the students that they don't like, because we allow this kind of element of ambiguity or, spaces where our unconscious biases can kind of lead us astray. So now I want to talk about like why GPA is just inherently wrong through this lens of like looking at it from like, where does it come from? How do we attain it? Stuff like that. And then we are going to talk about our model after this. Don't worry. So we see that like people with like much better accesses to resources are much more able to attain a higher GPA once they get into college. So we see like, let's take the example of a physics class. We have one kid that went to a prep school, got taught in physics, got taught in calculus before they came to college. And then we have another kid that went to a public school, did not take physics, did not take calculus, actually did not have to take math after, algebra trig. They will be, completely overwhelmed by this process. So we see that like it is already inherently much easier for the rich kid to get an A and the poor kid to get a C. And even though they pass the class in the eyes of the professor, they have learned enough information to make it onto physics 2. We will see that the A student will be much easier, much more likely to find a job, to find employment, to have a nicer life, even though the professor says that they can both move on to the next class, right? So now let's talk about what a pass-fail model looks like. We see that a pass-fail model would be, again, mostly determined by the professors of what is, an acceptable amount of work to pass the class. We actually see this already with just the advent of grading. If you get a C in a class, you have passed it, right? We have determined that you have gained the, necessary amount of information. And quite frankly, I think it's on the job of the opposition to prove like why we need to show more than that, right? So we see that like this would be determined by professors, what you need to pass the class, but it takes away this ambiguity element of like, oh, I really like this person, so they're going to get an A paper versus a B paper, right? We see that both these kids in the example I brought up would just be represented equally. They would have shown a proficiency in the material and like move on, so we think that this has a much higher potential of creating a more equitable society, because when you like see that like everybody goes through like a pass fail system. Students then would have to, develop their hard skills and show these in job interviews on resumes, like show actual personality. They can't just rely on daddy's money to, buy them the nice things in life. They, have to compete with all these other kids that are all of a sudden on their same level for like the opportunities that were previously handed to them, right? So now I'm going to talk about like what grades do to us and like why they're not like a good determinant of who we are as people. But before that, I will take the POI.
Your talk about like how everything is arbitrary is just false. Like even in English or philosophy, there's a metric on what is a good paper and what is a bad paper that determines like, how you should be graded.
Okay, yeah, I got it. So like, I think you're kind of misrepresenting me. I didn't say everything was arbitrary, right? We actually pointed out that we make a system for passing the classes. It's called getting a C, right? So what the point was is that after that, we see that a lot of this stuff is determined arbitrarily, because if your English professor thinks that one very specific way to write a paper is the exact right way, and you've never been exposed to that before, you need to work much, much harder to like obtain that A, obtain that good grade, even though there's several good ways to write a paper. There isn't actually one defined way in many of these disciplines for like how we should carry about ourselves. So like now let's talk about what grades do to us in this final minute and a half. Grades are horrible. They're horrible determinants of who we are. We're like not good at like a lot of things, like people generally have one very specific interest or maybe even a couple, but past that, like I am not good at physics, like I hated that class. We see that like when we institute these systems, it creates a much higher potential for just psychological, sanity. Like, and we actually see this at universities in the status quo. For instance, MIT made their entire freshman year pass fail because of the extremely high suicide rate that was present before that, because if you did not get that A, you were like gonna fail life, basically. That's like what the thought process that went through these students' minds. So we see that if we institute a pass fail model, like you just don't have to worry about it anymore. You can like hit that pass and then move on to the next thing, move on to the thing that you enjoy doing in life. Nobody wants to like dedicate time to things that they just don't care about. So like, let's, let people be themselves. Let's, remove the stigma from grading. Let's make it a more equitable society. Very proud to propose. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank the government for that great speech, and I'd like to invite the leader of the opposition to give his speech now.
All right, so okay, we are going to make the case for why we want to keep the current model, which is having a grade point average system. So we recently just heard that, well, if you take this away, it'll create a different culture in the classroom, and therefore kids will not be valued based on their grades. But to be fair, let's talk about life after college. There is a point in where a student will have to go into more exclusive law schools, or just so on and so forth. Just many programs that are mostly open to kids that have higher grades. So how do you place a value on what you have learned? And also, would you therefore then raise what the standard is for passing? Because currently it is 60%. So, or should we praise everyone who has only managed to learn 60% of what is in the classroom? And I do hear the argument of how there are certain classes, more classes in the college of arts and sciences, well, particularly like English courses. But to be fair, there is no certain way to write a paper, but there are certain ways to cite, and there are other things you learn from these courses. And what if the standard to pass is that certain way of writing a paper? that student would still get punished. Now, moving on. First, like, we'll take the point of order, or is that what it stands for?
Yeah, POI, it's just POI, point of information. So modern day schools, modern day postgraduate school, or postgraduate schools like medical schools, law schools, and things like that already consider things like work experience or demonstrated interest, and don't just solely focus on grades.
Okay, but if you don't have any grade, if you don't have any grade metric, right, then you're solely depending on these other things. Now, okay, to be fair, wouldn't that therefore lead to more testing? Because you cannot have someone come in with, okay, let's say if you plan to go to law schools do not ask for you to clerk for, let's say, 5+ years prior to going in. Many students go into law school right after college. So that whole thing about having all this time when working here and there doesn't really work there. And I would say that the other point is that it would lessen the value of these top schools, because if the standards have dropped and if you can't measure what is the highest student in a class, well, then how would they get into the top schools in the nation? And on top of that, that's just for graduate schools. How would a student transfer? Transferring, it's not about having 3+ years of working here and there. I mean, if you could transfer from being at one school as a freshman and one school as a sophomore, what would dictate, like, how would you measure that? Because, I mean, to be perfectly frank, if I started at a school that I knew was not the greatest, and I really did work a lot in order to transfer to what I think is a better school, how would that school measure who I am if it were not for my grades? And well, hopefully I answered that part of the that POI. But to be fair, just on the last point, there are students that would be placed at a disadvantage for both systems. But I feel like in ours, you're placing all of what matters onto one test. Because, for example, if you cannot transfer to a new college, then your performance in high school, your performance on the SAT and all these other tests is all that will dictate who you are and where you will be for the next 4 years if you cannot transfer to a new place. And I would assume also that if you have no other metric to measure these students, more tests will be placed all across the nation, either for law schools, med schools, or even jobs, to measure what a student has learned if these colleges cannot really measure that through grades. And with that, I will yield the rest of my time.
So yeah, I'd like to thank Oscar for presenting his side of the debate. I'd like to pass it back to the Gov side. Me, I think, yeah.
All right, cool. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. So how this is going to play out, I'm going to do a little bit of an integrated rebuttal, and then I'm going to move into my extension. So first, I want to start off with what I believe is like a mischaracterization by opposition of what the future would hold if this change were to go into effect. This idea that there would be more testing, specifically in the graduate world, and more testing maybe even for work and for acquiring jobs and for transferring and things like that. It centers around this idea, I guess, that GPA is what differentiates students and displays a mastery of subjects and things like that. And sure, but we'd argue that GPA really just displays a mastery within the classroom. It displays a mastery of the ability to sit in the classroom, raise your hand, answer your questions, and conduct your test. And sure, GPA can be used for admission into things like higher education, but not within higher education, we believe, because within higher education, this is what you're doing. But once you are within a college setting, we need to shift the focus from this arbitrary memorization to really the real world. And that's like experience, interests, demonstrations, and really like abilities. And there's this thing like you can do things in undergrad. You can, to show your interest in graduate studies, you can compete, you can join clubs, you can conduct volunteer experience. And right now, we believe that graduate schools do place an emphasis on these agendas, but the fact is that we don't believe that it's enough. In fact, because everything is so clouded by this idea of GPA, and because we place such a strong emphasis on GPA, things like work experience are tossed to the side. And I don't believe that the future would be this sort of testing hellhole that opposition proposes. Instead, you can do things like, for instance, in law school, more emphasis would just be put on volunteering. And really, instead of putting an emphasis on this of grinding away for an extra 0.1 addition to your GPA, we will put a greater emphasis on what we would like to call pure learning, right? And what really is pure learning? Pure learning, once again, it's not really slaving away for an extra 0.1. Instead, it's inherently experimental, and it's sparked by curiosity and interest. That's why learning is inherently a human thing to do. We as humans, it's within our nature to be sparked by curiosity, right? And this goes into one of our first points, and that's this idea that learning should be experimental and that we should also broaden our horizons, right? By switching to a pass-fail model, you can have students feel free to explore more diverse and different topics that go beyond just their confines of their major and their minor. You can have students who are truly inspired and truly like read a course catalog and be like, that course sounds interesting, I'm going to go ahead and take it. This in and of itself is learning, right? Learning is when you have an interest onto a subject and you apply yourself to said subject. You're not just grinding away for an arbitrary number, right? And I would argue that this has a further snowball effect on this idea of pure learning, because people are taking these courses because of this very interest. And by then, they're only going to work harder within these courses because it's they themselves who motivated themselves to then take these courses. And then before I move on, I'll take a POI if there is one.
What do you think is going to be the value of education, given that most of the people go to university to distinguish themselves, and now universities, like, education doesn't matter that much, especially in like going to like industry or so on?
Well, you still have this opportunity to distinguish yourself. Sure, you have this opportunity to take a specified major or minor, but I'm proposing that you can work beyond these confines. But at the same time, within university, you also are exposed to other resources and other clubs as well that allow you to express your interests. It's through universities and clubs that you're able to gain this work experience, go on a co-op, for instance, if your university has such a co-op program, and really you're able to do that. And then I just go on to emphasize some of the points that the Prime Minister brought on in his first speech. This idea that we want to create an inherently more egalitarian society. We want to create more equal learning experience. We believe that education should be equal. We believe that students shouldn't have unfair privileges or advancements landed upon themselves because of their economic situations, and thereby having more access to resources like prep and things like that. Rather, if they use the resources that their university gives to them for access to jobs, for access to things like that, then they'd be able to not only demonstrate themselves as better workers, but as better prepared for the real world. And yeah, with that, I am proud to support the motion.
Thanks for that great speech. I'd like to invite the leader of the opposition to close out the debate.
Thank you. Just give me a second while I pull up all my thoughts. Starting for the sake of time, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the proposition has a very skewed view of the case, right? They talk to you about like all the advantages of like pass-fail system, like they have this like how GPA is so bad that we don't need to like, have this sort of system. We need to have like this egalitarian society without ever proving like why pass-fail system is specific to achieving those goals. And what we'll bring to you is like this contextualization of how the world looks like, how GPA plays into those sort of mechanisms, and how like the inequality that already exists mean that GPA is an important need specifically to people from disadvantaged background, right? So let's understand the context, right? Like in a pass-fail system, you have no incentive to go beyond the minimum for most people, especially those who are not interested in academia. So like proposition talks about, oh, most people are here, they want to learn, they want to like explore diverse stuff. Understand that like most people, even in the current status quo, are go to universities to get a job or to like go into like particular programs. At the end of the day, the whole mechanism is employment based, except certain people who only want to do like I'll take the POI later, who only want to do like something related to academia, but most people still want to go for that particular purposes, right? So understand that industries would still exist and would still need to do some sort of qualification to select candidates anyway. Their whole idea that GPA doesn't matter at all, and then they go around and say that GPA is bad for like all of these purposes is contradictory in itself, right? If GPA doesn't matter in all of those sort of things, then like why GPA would matter to people's, or like how like what determines people, right? That's a contradiction and tension anyway. But understand it, despite all the characterization, GPA is still important. You go to law school, if you have a bad GPA, it's very hard to get in. You go to like a particular thing, like bad GPA disadvantages you in a lot of ways, right? The reason for that is GPA is your education for 4 years. All the material you have learned, it's an evaluation and a distinction of like what you've done across all 4 years. And it holds a major component. Even places where they don't care about GPA much still like value it to a certain extent, because it gives an idea of how much you can work for 4 years, specifically because that's important to whether law school or the industry that you're going to and so on, right? So understand that industries would still exist and need to do some sort of qualification to select candidates anyway. But now they cannot distinguish based on whatever educational institute you went to, because at the end of the day, a lot of people would pass, right? Like maybe imagine 50% of people pass all their courses. At the end of the day, there's no way to distinguish between those sort of people anyway, right? So at the end of the day, all that matters is you pass or you don't pass. And now you passed, now you need to determine that anyway, right? So understand how that's likely going to happen. So industry or law schools would likely make their own test. What that means is right now with like GPA system, universities are moving away from standardized testing. But what that particular means is that we need standardized testing even more. Now, what's the problem with standardized testing or like these one exams being done? So there are two facets of like layering, right? Why is it bad if industry does it rather than university? First thing is coaching, right? Like if there's a large exam, people who are privileged can go to coaching institute. That's what like happens with SAT. You have Princeton Review going in and like, coaching those institutes, and people going in and performing better because of those. If you go to India, where there's like one entrance exam that determines which college you go into, like people spend 4 years, put a lot of money, instead of focusing good, they go to like fake schools that allow you to skip out and just like study for those exams. And at the end of the day, all that matters is like that sort of thing to get into the sort of value. And what that particularly means is now you're focused on that. So right now, at least you were interested in your education in particular classes because you would want to do well in them in certain degree, because at the end of the day, it matters to your GPA or it matters to your transcript. But now what ends up happening is that you have like this one sort of whatever is going to happen right now, and all your focus is on getting work experience, getting like these sort of things that are going to determine those things later. And that particularly means that you don't focus on that education anymore, which is the first thing you came to get in the university in the second place. So that there's things like coaching, like in one large exam. Another thing, whatever ends up happening later will be very non-holistic and centered on the needs of each individual places rather than how qualified and learned individuals are. At least your GPA determines how much you know the material you've studied in physics, rather than like, your mastery over those sort of things. But the place you're applying is not going to care about your mastery in the subject and what you've done and how much you've learned. Rather, they're going to care about their specific needs. And you'll basically be catering around like those sort of ideas, right? Now, why is it bad if there's one exam rather than many over the whole undergraduate degree? Understand that like people basically go to universities to sort of like just forget what I said. I'm saying like, why do people like have one like exams spanning over universities, right? Understand that those exams are going to be more holistic. They will study what exactly you studied in each class and what exactly you achieved in each class. If you're taking English class, you're going to learn how to write a proper paper, and you're being evaluated on that. One major exam that's going to cover that is not going to happen, and it's likely it will happen in their paradigm, right? It won't be holistic to the degree a 5 year of university would be. And also understand that like there's no like just exams, right? There are classes that have only participation. There are classes classes that have like group work, there are classes that have only homeworks depending on those classes. Those things won't exist on their paradigm because there's like one sort of qualification. But next thing is to talk about like the value of university, right? Understand why do people from lower financial grounds go to college, right? Because economic mobility. They feel that like if they can somehow take loan or apply for scholarships and go to college, that can help them move up the economic ladder, right? Because at the end of the day, after they do well in university, they distinguish themselves from other people who are doing that. And because like unlike coaching for friends review, you have like 4 years to demonstrate all the effort that you have done in multiple number of classes. They go to university because it allows them to climb up the economic ladder. Pass fail undermines the legitimacy of university in most people's eyes. Like now most people are not going to care about what university is about in the first place. And now what that particularly means is that like there's lesser value in it. And that particularly means people from lower economic backgrounds have no incentive to go to universities because already universities are fucking expensive. These people are already taking a big gamble or applying for scholarship, working really hard to move the economic ladder by going to universities. Now you even take away that legitimacy where they allow themselves to distinguish out of it, that they are not likely to go into these sort of mechanisms. And that hurts these group of people, right? Like it's a method of discrimination that is happening in those regards. So understand it decreases the value of education in the very first place. And that's very problematic from both sides of the paradigm. So what do we present to you? We present to you this idea, the importance of education and how GPA depends on it because of distinguishing yourself from other peers across 4 years in different classes, something that doesn't happen on their side because at the end of the day, however system, like a given number of people will mostly pass their classes, unless they're going to say that like, oh, we're going to fail most of the people in the classes. Other than that, like at the end of the day, we provide to you like how anything, it likely leads to more problems, systemic problems happening on industry and other levels. And for those reasons, we're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to thank Umesh for his great speech. And yeah, I guess I'll need some time to tally up the points and think about it a little bit.
I'm going to stop the recording and streaming.